"Get out before we drag you," they told Clara Whitmore, loud enough for every soul on that dusty street to hear, loud enough to make it sound like law instead of threat. And still she didn't move, not an inch. Not even when the wind pushed loose strands of her chestnut hair across her face and the noon sun burned down like judgment on Red Hollow. Because Clara had learned a long time ago that stepping back once meant stepping back forever. And this town had been waiting to see which kind of woman she was the moment she signed her name on that piece of land just beyond the ridge, the one no one thought she had the right to own. Not a woman, not alone, not here, and the men in front of her knew it too. You could see it in the way they stood just a little too close, boots planted wide, hands loose but ready, like they weren't talking to her so much as testing the idea of her, measuring how much it would take to make her fold. And behind them the town watched from porches and windows. Silent. Always silent. Because out here silence kept you safe, silence kept you fed, silence meant you didn't have to pick a side until the side had already won. And Clara felt every one of those eyes without turning her head, felt the weight of them like heat on her back, but her gaze stayed forward, steady, green-brown eyes catching the light without a flicker, because she wasn't looking at the men, not really, she was looking through them, past the dust, past the noise, at something they couldn't see, something they couldn't touch, and that unsettled them more than any raised voice ever could. "You deaf or just stupid?" one of them said, stepping closer, close enough now that the smell of stale tobacco and sweat edged into the space between them, his shadow cutting across her boots, across the hem of her cream blouse, across the line she had drawn without saying a word, and still she didn't answer, not yet. Because Clara Whitmore understood something most people in Red Hollow had forgotten. That power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waited, quiet, patient, letting other people reveal themselves first, and the man reached out then, fingers brushing the fabric at her sleeve like he expected her to flinch, like he expected the story to end right there with her stepping back into the dust where he thought she belonged. And for just a second the whole street seemed to lean forward, holding its breath, waiting to see if she would break, waiting to see if this was the moment the town proved itself right about her. And that was when the air changed, not with a gust of wind or the crack of a gun, but with something subtler, heavier, like the ground itself had shifted half an inch beneath their boots, and somewhere behind those men, just out of their sight, a pair of footsteps came to a stop, slow, deliberate, close enough now that even the silence felt different, and Clara's eyes flickered once. Just once, not in fear but in recognition, as if she had been expecting this all along. The men did not turn around right away, and that was the first sign something was wrong, because in Red Hollow a man always checked his back when the air shifted like that. But pride can make a person slow, and these men had built their lives on never being the first to hesitate, so they held their ground a second too long, long enough for the silence to stretch, long enough for the people watching from the porch across the street to lean just slightly forward, as if they all felt it at once. That something had entered the space without announcing itself, and Clara Whitmore saw it before anyone else did, not with her eyes, not fully, but in the way the man in front of her loosened his grip without realizing it, his fingers slipping just a fraction from her sleeve, like his body understood before his mind caught up, and that was when he finally glanced over his shoulder, just a quick look, careless, like he expected to see nothing worth noting, but the look did not stay careless. It stopped halfway, caught on something behind him, something that did not move, and that was enough, because when one man falters the others feel it, even if they pretend they do not, and now all three of them turned, not together, not smoothly, but one after the other, each a little slower than they would have liked, and there he was, standing in the shade just beyond the edge of the sun, hat low, coat carrying the dust of miles, not close enough to crowd them, not far enough to be ignored. Elias Carter did not step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for anything at his side. He simply stood, shoulders square, eyes steady, as if he had been there the entire time and the rest of them were only now catching up to the truth. And for a moment no one spoke, not the men, not the crowd, not even the wind, and the town that had chosen. Silence before found itself holding a different kind of silence now, heavier, sharper, because this one had weight behind it, the kind that came from a man who did not need to prove anything to anyone, and the one who had spoken earlier, the loudest of the three, tried to recover first, straightening up, rolling his shoulders as if to remind himself who he was supposed to be. But something had shifted inside him, something small but undeniable, and it showed in the way his words came out slower. This time, less certain, like he was speaking for the sake of hearing his own voice rather than controlling the moment, and Elias did not answer him. Not yet. He just looked, and that look moved from one man to the next, not challenging, not threatening, just measuring, as if he were deciding whether any of this was worth the trouble. And that was worse than anger, because anger could be answered, anger could be matched. But this kind of calm left no place to stand, and behind them Clara finally let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her posture unchanged, her chin still level, but something in her eyes softened just a fraction, not relief, not quite, something closer to confirmation, as if the moment unfolding was exactly the one she had expected all along, and the man closest to her took a small step back without meaning to, just an inch, just enough to break the line they had formed around her. And once that line broke, it could not be put back together the same way again. No one moved, and that was what everyone remembered later, not the words, not even the moment itself, but the way time seemed to hold its breath on. That stretch of wood and dust as Elias Carter stood there with nothing in his hands and everything in his presence. And the man who had first spoken to Clara tried again, because silence like that demanded to be broken, but his voice did not carry the same weight anymore. It came out thinner, like it had lost something between his chest and the open air, and Elias listened without interrupting, without shifting, his eyes steady in that quiet way that made a man feel seen in places he would rather keep hidden. And it became clear, slowly, almost painfully, that this was no longer about land or pride, or even Clara Whitmore standing in the sun. This was about whether those three men would keep pretending they had control or admit, even just for a second, that they did not. And the one closest to Clara glanced at her again, as if expecting her to step away now that the balance had changed, but she did not move. Not toward Elias, not away from the men. She simply remained, shoulders squared, as if she belonged exactly where she was. And that made the choice harder for them, because it meant there was no easy exit that saved face, no simple way to turn this into a joke or a misunderstanding. And somewhere behind them a chair creaked on a porch, a small sound, but loud enough in the stillness to remind everyone that they were being watched, that this moment would not disappear once it passed. And the leader exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled, trying to gather what little authority he still held, and for a second it looked like he might push forward again, might say something sharp enough to force the scene back into the shape he wanted. But then Elias took one step, not fast, not threatening, just one measured step into the light, and the sun caught the worn edge of his hat, the dust along his coat, the scar that ran faint across his brow. And something in that step settled the matter without a single word needing to follow, because it was not a move toward them. It was a move into the truth of the moment, and the man in front of Clara lowered his hand completely, letting it fall to his side like it no longer belonged where it had been. And the others followed in small ways, a shift of weight, a glance toward the ground, a tightening of the jaw that spoke louder than any threat they could have made. And then, without announcement, without agreement, they stepped back, one after the other, not running, not rushing, but leaving all the same, as if the space between them and Clara had suddenly become something they could not cross. And Elias did not watch them go for long, his attention returning instead to Clara, not with urgency, not with concern, just a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them like something already understood, and she gave the smallest nod, barely visible, but enough. And around them the town shifted again, people straightening, voices returning in low murmurs, but nothing quite as it had been before, because everyone there had just seen something they could not easily explain. A moment where no one raised a hand, and yet everything changed, and in Red Hollow, that kind of change did not come from force. It came from a line that someone finally refused to step back from. The dust settled slowly after they left, not because the wind had died, but because something heavier had taken its place, and Clara Whitmore remained where she stood for a moment longer, as if she were letting the town catch up to what had just happened, her fingers brushing lightly against her sleeve where the fabric had been disturbed, not in fear, not in anger, just in quiet acknowledgement. And when she finally moved, it was not away, but forward, one step across the same boards they had tried to claim from her, her boots steady, her posture unchanged, as if nothing about her direction had ever been in question, and Elias Carter watched without speaking, his gaze following her just long enough to be certain she did not need anything from him that she had not already taken for herself. Because that was the thing about Clara, she did not borrow strength, she stood in her own, and that was what made men like those leave, not the presence behind them, but the realization that the woman in front of them was not going to bend no matter who stood beside her. And the door to the saloon creaked as she pushed it open, the sound carrying across the street like a line drawn in wood and air, and for the first time that day someone inside stepped back to make room, not out of fear, not entirely, but out of something closer to respect, though no one would say the word out loud. Not yet. And outside, Elias shifted his weight slightly, the smallest movement, his hand resting near his side without purpose, without tension, just a man standing where he had chosen to stand, and the town noticed, even if they pretended they did not, because stories in places like Red Hollow did not begin with noise. They began with moments like this, moments where nothing obvious happened, and yet everything changed direction. And across the street, a woman who had watched from behind a curtain now stepped out onto the porch, her eyes following Clara through the doorway, then drifting to Elias, as if trying to understand the connection between the two without asking the question, and a man near the hitching post cleared his throat, adjusting his hat as though he had suddenly remembered how to stand, how to be seen. And that was how it started, not with declarations, not with apologies, but with small shifts, inches of space given where before there had been none. And inside the saloon, Clara paused just past the threshold, the dim light soft against her features, the scent of wood and coffee settling around her. And for a brief second she allowed herself to breathe differently, deeper, not because the danger had passed, but because she had chosen her ground and held it. And outside, Elias turned slightly, his eyes scanning the street once more, not searching, not guarding, just observing, as if committing the moment to memory without needing to hold on to it, because men like him did not linger where they were not needed. And yet he did not leave right away, not until the quiet of the town felt different than before, not until the silence carried less fear and more thought. And when he finally stepped away, it was as measured as his arrival, one step, then another, boots soft against the dirt, leaving behind no sound that could be followed, only the memory of a moment where no one raised a voice, and still the balance of an entire street had shifted. And in the shade of the saloon doorway, Clara glanced once toward the light outside, not to look for him, but to mark the place where something had changed. And for the first time since she arrived in Red Hollow, the town did not feel like it was waiting for her to leave. The room inside carried a different kind of quiet, one that did not come from fear but from adjustment, as if every person in that saloon was recalculating something they had believed just minutes ago. And Clara Whitmore felt it the moment the door closed behind her, not in the way anyone looked at her directly, because most of them did not, but in the way conversations paused a second too long before continuing, in the way chairs shifted to give her space without making it obvious, in the way the man behind the counter straightened his back before asking what she would like, his voice careful, measured, like he had decided that whatever rules had been in place before no longer applied the same way. And Clara stepped forward with that same steady rhythm, boots soft against worn floorboards, her gaze moving across the room without hurry, taking in the faces, the angles, the distance between people, not judging, not searching, just seeing, because she understood something that most did. Not that a town reveals itself in the seconds after something changes, not during it. And she rested her hand lightly on the edge of the counter, the wood warm from years of use, and asked for water, nothing more, nothing less, her voice even, untouched by what had happened outside. And the man nodded quickly, almost too quickly, turning to pour from a metal pitcher as if eager to do something right, something simple, something that did not require choosing sides. And when he set the glass down in front of her, there was a small hesitation, like he expected her to say something else, to make a claim, to declare a position, but she did not. She simply took the glass and held it for a moment, letting the coolness settle into her palm before lifting it, because Clara Whitmore was not there to prove anything to anyone. She had already done that the moment she refused to step back. And across the room a pair of men who had been speaking earlier now lowered their voices, their words. Softer, not out of secrecy, but out of awareness, as if they had realized that volume carried weight they did not fully control anymore. And one of them glanced toward the door, then back to Clara, then away again, unsure where to place his attention, and that uncertainty spread quietly, moving from one corner of the room to another, not dramatic, not sudden, just present, like a shift in the weather you feel before you see, and outside, though she could not see him. The memory of Elias Carter lingered in the space he had occupied, not as a figure, but as a standard, something unspoken that now sat in the minds of everyone who had witnessed that moment. And Clara took a slow sip of water, her posture relaxed but grounded, her eyes reflecting the dim light in a way that made it hard to read what she was thinking. And that was intentional, because out here, being unreadable was its own kind of strength. And as the seconds passed, the room began to settle into a new rhythm, quieter, more deliberate, as if Red Hollow itself had taken a step it could not undo. And for the first time since she had arrived, Clara did not feel like she was standing against the town. She felt like she was standing within it, and that difference, small as it seemed, was where everything that came next would begin. The glass touched the counter with a soft sound that carried farther than it should have, not because it was loud, but because the room had grown quiet enough to notice small things again. And Clara Whitmore set it down without hurry, her fingers releasing the edge as if she had all the time in the world, which in a place like Red Hollow was its own kind of statement, because time here usually belonged to whoever spoke the loudest or stood the tallest. And for the first time that afternoon, neither of those things seemed to matter quite as much, and the man behind the counter lingered a moment longer than necessary, wiping a spot that was already clean, his eyes flicking up and away as if he wanted to say something, but had not yet decided what kind of man he was going to be in this new version of the day. And Clara did not press him. She did not ask for more, because she understood that people arrived at their choices in their own time, and pushing them only sent them back to where they had started. And across the room, one of the men who had lowered his voice earlier shifted in his seat and finally stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to cross the floor and place a few coins on the counter near Clara's glass, not looking at her directly, not announcing anything, just leaving them there as if settling a debt no one had spoken aloud. And for a second it seemed like the room might hold its breath again, waiting to see how she would respond. But Clara only glanced at the coins, then back at the man, her expression unchanged, and gave a slight nod, not gratitude, not dismissal, something in between, something that allowed him to keep his dignity while still acknowledging the shift that had taken place. And that was how it continued, not with grand gestures, but with small corrections. A chair pulled back an extra inch, a path cleared without comment, a voice lowered instead of raised, and each one added to something larger that no one could quite name yet. And outside the light had softened just slightly, the edge of afternoon settling in, and though Elias Carter was no longer in sight, the space he had occupied remained in the minds of those who had seen him, not as a threat, not as a force, but as a reminder that a single presence could change the shape of a moment without claiming it. And Clara reached for the folded paper tucked inside her vest, the one that carried her name and the land she had come here for, and she placed it on the counter with the same steady motion she had used for everything else, not presenting it, not defending it, simply setting it down where it belonged. And the man behind the counter looked at it, really looked this time, his eyes tracing the ink, the seal, the proof of something he could not argue with even if he wanted to. And when he looked back up at her, there was no hesitation left, only a quiet acceptance that settled between them like the dust outside. And he gave a small nod of his own, slower, more certain, and in that exchange something else shifted, something deeper than before, because now it was not just about a moment on the street. It was about what came after, about who Clara Whitmore was allowed to be in this town from this point forward. And she did not smile. She did not soften. She simply stood there as she had from the beginning, unchanged. And that was what made the difference, because everything around her had begun to move. The paper remained on the counter, and for a moment it seemed like that single sheet carried more weight than anything spoken that day, because it was not just ink and seal, it was proof. And proof had a way of unsettling places that had long relied on assumption instead. And Clara Whitmore did not touch it again after setting it down, She let it sit there in plain view, not hidden, not defended. Because truth did not need either when it was allowed to exist without interruption, and the man behind the counter finally reached for it. Not quickly, not with hesitation, but with a kind of care that suggested he understood the line he was stepping across, his fingers tracing the edge before lifting it slightly, just enough to read. And the room watched without appearing to watch, eyes drifting, shoulders still, conversations slowing into quiet murmurs that carried no real words. Only the sound of people adjusting to something they had not planned for, and as he read, something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough, his back straightening, his head lifting just a fraction, as if the paper confirmed something he had not dared to accept before. And when he placed it back down, it was no longer just an object on the counter. It was a fact that had been acknowledged, and that made it harder for anyone else to deny. And Clara saw that change, not in his hands, but in his eyes, the way they met hers without sliding away, and that was all she needed, because recognition, once given, could not be taken back without consequence. And across the room the same man who had left the coins shifted again, this time turning fully toward her, his voice low but clear enough to carry, asking about the land beyond the ridge, not challenging, not accusing, just asking. And that question did something unexpected. It opened a space where before there had only been resistance, and Clara answered simply, her words steady, describing the acreage, the water line, the stretch of fence that needed repair, nothing exaggerated, nothing defensive, just the truth as it was. And the man nodded slowly, considering it, and another voice joined, then another, questions forming where earlier there had only been judgment, and the room began to change in a way no one could have forced, shifting from a place that pushed her out to one that, slowly, almost reluctantly, began to make room. And outside the light moved across the street, shadows lengthening by inches, marking the passage of time in a way that felt different now, less like something pressing down and more like something unfolding. And Clara remained where she was, not taking advantage of the moment, not pushing it further than it could hold, because she understood that real change did not come from forcing people to agree. It came from giving them the space to see differently on their own, and somewhere beyond the walls of the saloon, beyond the edge of town, the land she had claimed waited, unchanged by any of this, patient, steady. And as the conversations inside continued, quiet but real, it became clear that what had started as a single moment on a dusty street was no longer contained there. It had moved, settled, taken root in the minds of the people who had witnessed it. And Clara Whitmore did not need to say anything more, because the town had already begun to speak for itself in ways it had not before. The questions did not come all at once. They came in pieces, slow and careful, like men testing the depth of water before stepping in. And Clara Whitmore answered each one the same way she had answered the first, without embellishment, without hesitation, her voice steady as she spoke of acreage and boundaries, of a water source that held even through dry months, of fence lines that needed mending before winter came. And with each word the room shifted a little more, not toward agreement, not yet, but toward understanding. And that was something Red Hollow had not offered her before, not when she arrived, not when she signed her name, not even when she stood her ground outside. And the man who had first asked about the land leaned his weight onto the counter now, no longer keeping distance. His attention fixed on her not with suspicion but with interest, the kind that comes when a story begins to make sense in a way you did not expect. And another man closer to the window spoke up, asking about the cost of supplies, about whether she planned to run cattle or keep the land for something else. And Clara answered that too, explaining her plans without turning them into promises, because she understood that in places like this, promises meant less than consistency, and consistency was something you proved over time, not in a single afternoon. And outside the light had shifted further, the golden edge of late day stretching across the street, touching the hitching post, the steps, the places where people had stood earlier. And though the men who had confronted her were no longer there, their absence still held a shape in the memory of the town, a reminder of what had almost happened and what had not. And that contrast lingered, quiet but persistent. And inside the saloon the man behind the counter finally spoke again, his voice more certain now, asking if she would be needing regular deliveries, feed, tools, The kind of question that did not come from doubt, but from expectation, and Clara paused for a moment before answering. Not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of what was being offered, not just goods, but acknowledgement, a place in the rhythm of the town's daily life. And she nodded once, her expression calm, her words simple, confirming what she intended without making it larger than it was. And that was enough. Because in that moment something settled into place, something that had been uncertain before, and across the room a chair scraped softly as someone stood, not to leave, but to move closer, to listen, to be part of something that had begun without anyone deciding it should. And Clara remained where she was, not taking ownership of the room, not drawing attention to herself, just existing within it as she had. From the beginning, unchanged. And that was what made the difference, because everything around her continued to adjust, continued to move, while she stayed exactly who she had always been. And in Red Hollow, that kind of steadiness was harder to ignore than any show of force, because it left no room for doubt, only for recognition. And as the sun lowered another inch outside, the town found itself standing in a moment it could not undo, a moment where a woman had not been pushed out, and no one could pretend they had not seen it. The rhythm of the room had changed enough now that no one could pretend it was the same place it had been an hour ago, and yet no one named it, not out loud, because naming something like that meant admitting it had happened, and Red Hollow was not a town that moved quickly when it came to admitting anything. And Clara Whitmore understood that as she listened to the questions settle into something quieter, something less about testing her and more about placing her, figuring out where she fit, in a place that had already decided she did not. And the man by the window leaned back against the frame now, arms crossed loosely, no longer guarding his words, asking about the stretch of land beyond the creek, whether it held through the late summer heat. And Clara answered that it did, that she had walked it herself, measured it in steps and distance, in the way the ground felt under her boots, not just in numbers written on paper. And that answer carried weight, because it meant she had not just claimed the land, she had known it. And knowing something out here meant more than owning it. And a low murmur passed through the room, not agreement, not approval, just acknowledgement. And that was how it built, piece by piece, small shifts that stacked into something larger without anyone deciding they should. And behind the counter the man reached for a ledger, flipping it open with emotion that had become familiar over years of routine. But today there was a pause before he wrote anything down, his eyes lifting once more to Clara, not questioning, not doubting, just confirming. And when she gave the slightest nod, he set pen to paper, marking something that had not been written there before, not just a name, but a place within the structure of the town. And that act, simple as it was, carried farther than any raised voice could have, because it turned possibility into record, and records had a way of lasting longer than memory. And across the room, someone shifted a chair, closer to the table, making space where there had been none. And another man set his hat down instead of keeping it in his hands. Small gestures, but each one a sign that the tension that had once filled the room was loosening its hold. And outside the light continued to move, stretching longer shadows across the street. And though Elias Carter was gone, the echo of his presence remained in the choices being made now, in the way people spoke, in the way they paused before dismissing something they would have ignored before. And Clara took another slow sip of water, her gaze steady, not claiming the change, not directing it, just allowing it to unfold around her, because she knew that if it was real, it would hold without her forcing it, and if it was not, it would fall away on its own. And that was the difference between control and influence. One demanded, the other endured. And as the room settled into this new shape, quieter, more deliberate, it became clear that what had begun outside was no longer just a moment. It had become a direction, something the town was now moving toward whether it realized it or not. And Clara Whitmore stood at the center of it without ever asking to be, not because she had changed the town, but because she had refused to let the town change her. The pen scratched once more across the page, a quiet sound, but one that seemed to anchor everything that had shifted into something real. And the man behind the counter closed the ledger with a firm but measured motion, not dramatic, not symbolic, just final, as if a line had been drawn not on paper, but through the way the town would remember this day. And Clara Whitmore watched it without reaction, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, because she had not come here for approval. She had come for what was already hers. And yet even she could feel the difference now, not in what she held, but in how it was being held around her. And the man who had first asked about the land stepped closer again, this time not with hesitation, but with intent, his voice low, almost thoughtful, mentioning the stretch of fence along the east side, how the ground dipped there after heavy rain, how posts would need to be set deeper if she wanted them to last through winter. And Clara listened, not surprised, not guarded, just attentive, because this was the kind of conversation that did not happen unless something had already changed, and she nodded once, acknowledging the advice without surrendering authority. And that exchange carried farther than either of them intended, because it showed the other something simple and difficult at the same time. That respect did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it appeared in small, practical truths offered without demand. And across the room another man stood, adjusting his coat, then moving closer with a slow, deliberate step, adding a word about water flow near the ridge, how it shifted late in the season, not contradicting, not competing, just contributing. And the room followed, not all at once, but enough that the space no longer felt divided. It felt shared, and that was new. And outside, the shadows had lengthened into long lines across the street, stretching from one building to the next like quiet markers of time passing. And somewhere in that stretch of light and shade the memory of Elias Carter still lingered, not as a presence to rely on, but as a moment that had allowed everything else to begin. And Clara knew that without looking for him, without needing to, because what he had done was already complete, not in action, but in consequence. And she took another breath, steady and deep, letting the air settle in her chest as she looked around the room, not claiming it, not conquering it, just standing within it as she had from the start. And for the first time the space did not push back, it did not test her, it simply held. And that was when the man behind the counter spoke again, asking if she would be staying in town for the night or heading back out before dark. A simple question, but one that carried something beneath it, an assumption that she belonged in the rhythm of the place, that her presence did not need to be explained anymore. And Clara considered it for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the window where the last of the afternoon light touched the edge of the glass. And when she answered, her voice carried the same calm certainty it always had, but now it landed differently, because the town was finally ready to hear it. And in that quiet, steady exchange, Red Hollow shifted one more inch towards something it had not been before. Clara Whitmore did not answer right away, and that pause carried more meaning than any immediate reply could have, because in that moment the question was no longer just about where she would spend the night. It was about whether she saw herself as passing through or as part of what this place was becoming. And she let her gaze rest on the fading light at the window a second longer, watching how it stretched across the glass, how it softened the edges of everything it touched, before turning back toward the man behind the counter, her expression calm, unchanged. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet but certain, saying she would stay, not as a declaration, not as a challenge, just as a fact. And the room absorbed it the same way it had begun to absorb everything else she said, without resistance, without interruption. And that was the difference now, not in her words, but in how they were received. And the man behind the counter nodded once, already reaching beneath the counter for a key, placing it on the wood between them with a small, deliberate motion, not offering it like a favor, but setting it down like something expected, something ordinary. And that ordinariness was what made it matter, because it meant she no longer needed to be explained. And across the room a few men shifted, not out of discomfort, but out of adjustment, as if they were making room in their understanding for a version of this town that had not existed that morning. And one of them spoke up, again, mentioning the road out past the ridge, how it could be rough after sunset, not warning her, not advising her to leave, just adding a piece of information that assumed she would be traveling it again, that she would be returning. And Clara acknowledged it with a slight nod, taking in the detail without comment, because she understood that this was how things settled here, not through declarations, but through small exchanges that built into something larger over time. And outside, the last of the sunlight began to slip away, leaving behind longer shadows that stretched across the street, touching the places where the day had shifted, marking them without needing to explain why. And though Elias Carter was nowhere to be seen, The absence of him did not feel like emptiness. It felt like completion, as if his part in the story had already been fulfilled the moment he chose to stand where he did and say only what was necessary, and everything that followed belonged to the choices being made now. In this room, in these quiet voices, in the way people looked at Clara without turning away, and she reached for the key, her fingers closing around it with the same steady motion she had used for everything else, not holding it tightly, not hesitating, just accepting it as part of what came next. And for the first time since she had arrived, there was no sense of waiting in the air, no expectation that something would go wrong, only a quiet understanding that the direction had changed and that it would not easily turn back. And Clara Whitmore stood there in the softening light of the saloon, exactly as she had been from the beginning, and yet everything around her had learned how to stand differently. The key felt solid in Clara Whitmore's hand, heavier than its size should have allowed, not because of the metal itself, but because of what it represented, and she turned it once between her fingers before slipping it into the pocket of her vest. A small motion, quiet, almost unnoticed, yet it marked something final in the way the room held her now. And as she stepped back from the counter, the space did not close in behind her like it might have before. It remained open, as if the town itself had decided not to press where it once would have, and that absence of pressure carried its own kind of weight. And she moved toward the door at an unhurried pace, boots steady against the floorboards, each step measured, not cautious, not defiant, simply certain. And the conversations behind her continued, low and steady, no longer circling around her presence, but moving forward with it included. And that was the difference, subtle but undeniable, because she was no longer the interruption. She was part of the rhythm, and when her hand reached for the door, the light outside had softened into that quiet hour between day and night, where everything slows just enough to be noticed, and she stepped through. Into the open air, the scent of dust and cooling wood rising gently around her, the street stretching out in long shadows that traced where people had stood earlier, where decisions had been made without words, and she paused there for a moment, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, letting the silence of the evening settle in. And across the street, a man who had watched from a distance earlier gave a small nod as he passed, not stopping, not speaking, just acknowledging her in a way that did not ask for anything in return. And further down, a woman adjusting a lantern outside her doorway glanced up, her gaze meeting Clara's for a brief second before returning to her task. And even that small exchange held something new, something that had not been there before. And Clara continued walking, her path taking her past the hitching post, past the places where the earlier tension had gathered and then dissolved, each step carrying her forward, not away from the town, but deeper into it. And somewhere beyond the edge of the buildings, the land she had claimed waited in the fading light, quiet and unchanged, and she knew she would return there soon enough. But for now, she allowed herself this moment, this in-between space where the town and the land met, where what had happened and what would come next overlapped just enough to be felt. And as she moved toward the far end of the street, she did not look back, not because there was nothing behind her, but because she did not need to confirm it anymore. The change had already taken hold, not in words, not in promises, but in the way people had chosen to stand. And in Red Hollow, that was the kind of thing that lasted. The edge of town came quietly, not marked by a sign or a boundary anyone had agreed upon, but by the way the buildings thinned and the open land began to breathe again. And Clara Whitmore slowed her steps just enough to take it in, the wide stretch of earth ahead of her holding that familiar stillness, the kind that did not ask anything of a person except that they be honest with themselves. And behind her, Red Hollow settled into the evening, lamps being lit one by one, voices carrying low across the street, nothing urgent, nothing sharp, just the sound of a place finding a new rhythm without quite admitting it had changed. And Clara paused at the point where wood gave way to dirt, where the town ended and the land she had claimed began, and she let her gaze drift back once, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging. And in that quiet glance she saw it, not clearly, not completely, but enough, a figure across the street, half in shadow, standing still in that same way he had before, not stepping forward, not drawing attention, just present in the way that mattered. And Elias Carter did not raise a hand or call out. He did not need to, because whatever had needed to be said between them had already been understood without words. And Clara held that moment for a second longer, not as something to keep, but as something to recognize, the kind of understanding that does not ask for more than it gives. And then she turned back toward the open land, her boots pressing into the earth with a steady, certain rhythm, each step carrying her forward into something that was now fully hers, not because anyone had allowed it, but because she had stood where she needed to stand and refused to be moved. And behind her the town continued on, but not as it had been, because the people who had watched that afternoon would remember it in their own ways, in small choices, in quieter voices, in the way they looked at things they once dismissed. And that was how places changed out. Here, not with proclamations or force, but with moments that settled into memory and refused to leave. And Clara Whitmore did not look back again, not because she had nothing to leave behind, but because she had already taken what mattered with her, the space to stand, the right to remain, the quiet shift that no one could undo. And somewhere behind her, in the soft glow of lamplight and dust, a man who had said only one word earlier that day turned and walked the other way, not staying, not following, just leaving the moment where it belonged, complete, and in the fading light of the frontier, that was all the justice the land ever needed.